Hello, everyone. I'm going to start again. Hope you had a good lunch. I want to now use all of the animated stuff that Brent taught you all to build a modal component. So something like this for the feedback page, where there's this modal. You can drag it around, and if you drag it far enough, it goes away. And then you can bring it back. So something like this is actually really easy to do, or at least relatively easy to do in React Native using animated. And it's actually very performant if you use native driver, as Brent was showing, to do your animations. So we're going to try making this. I'm going to split it into two parts. First, I'm just going to bring up a modal element. And then I'm going to explain a little bit about gestures, so how to do the drag gesture. And then we'll actually add the gestures. Feel free at any point to stop me for questions or tell me to put code in Slack. My normal pace is really fast because I have a really short attention span. So that's why I normally go really fast. But like, slow me down or whatever if you run into trouble. So with that, let me stash my changes. So that I can make them again. So the last place we left our conference app was this. We've got the schedule tab and the feedback tab. And we're now going to add an animated modal to the feedback tab. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to install a package called React Native Root Modal. And this is a modal component that we can animate. The built-in modal that comes with React Native uses the operating system animation, but I want to do a custom animation so that we can use animated. So that's why we're adding React Native root modal. Now I'll go into the code. And I'm going to go to the feedback screen. And actually, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add a button that launches the modal. So I'll use button. And I'll add that at the top of the scroll view. We'll call it autofill contact info. And when we press it, we want to set state. We'll have something called modal visible be set to true. So this will make it so that whenever we press this button, we will change our state so that we show the modal. And then we'll set the state to default to modal visible false. So it'll start where it isn't shown, and then as soon as we press the button, it will be shown. Next, we're going to import modal from React Native root modal. And this is because you can put this modal anywhere in the component hierarchy, and it will always appear at the top. It like intercepts the entire view hierarchy at the top level and swaps out your root view with a fake root view that it can then add other children to. So it's a bit of a hack, but everyone uses it, so it's probably fine. It's a good rule for React Native in general. So we should be able to add this modal literally anywhere. Let's try adding it here. And we're going to say we want the modal to be visible. I'm going to grab modal visible from state. We want the modal to be visible when our state says that the modal is visible. And then just to test that it shows up, I'll stick in a view. This will just be temporary. We'll say width 100, height 100, and background color black. Hopefully this works. If it doesn't, I'll have to look at the docs for React Native Root Modal. So I have my button for autofill contact info. When I press it, nothing happens. So let me look at the docs for React Native Root Modal real quick. Unless there's another error that I'm missing. If so, just shout it out. Well, I don't know, but I wrote the code before, so I can look at what I did before. Visible, not modal visible. It's just called visible. So modal has a prop called visible. We'll set that to modal visible. And now it shows up. Amazing. So that is the first way to get a modal on the screen. And now I want to animate it. So I'm going to import animated. And I'm going to make a view that's like an overlay, I think, that sits behind the content of the modal, and then I'm going to make another view on top of it. And the view that sits behind the modal is just going to be this dark color, and then the view on top is going to be this white rectangle that has the content on it. So I'll start by making the content. Maybe I can use the same view here, just make it a little bigger, and make it white. And I want to animate the opacity of this. So in my state, I'm going to make a new variable called modal opacity, and it's going to be a new animated value. And I want opacity for the modal to start at 0. Now, in my view here, I'm going to use this modal opacity, grabbing it from state. And as soon as, invalid prop opacity. Say that again? Yes, good point. Forget that every single time. Now this won't animate because it's just always opacity 0, but at least it runs. And so when I press this button, I want to start an animation that changes the opacity. So I'm going to grab modal opacity from state. And I'm going to say animated.spring modal opacity to value 1. Let's see if that works. Nope. I need to run it. Good point. There we go. So now it's successfully animating in. There's no way to get it to go away. You'll also notice that the background of the modal, the sort of overlay behind it, is, I think, just the default of React Native Root Modal, because I'm not specifying that anywhere. So let me see if I can get rid of that by just saying background color is transparent. Cool. And then also, here's a useful thing that I don't think we've talked about yet. There's a shortcut for making the style of an element that's supposed to cover the entire screen. So normally you would do top 0, left 0, bottom 0, right 0, and position absolute. There's a shortcut, which is you can take an existing object called stylesheet.absoluteFill object, and you spread it into your style with the dots. And then this just means top 0, right 0, bottom 0, left 0, and position absolute. The other thing I'll need is justify content center and align items center. And that should, once again, center the modal. Cool. So the other thing I'm going to add is this overlay. The reason I got rid of the default one on the modal is because I want to customize it more and animate it. So I'm just going to make another animated view. And in the style, I'm going to say, again, opacity is modal opacity. I want this overlay to have a background color that's black but a little transparent. And I, again, want to have it take up the entire screen, so I'm going to use stylesheet.absoluteFill object. Cool. So now both the modal content and this background animated. So looks okay so far. I will tweak it a little bit and add the content so it looks even more like a modal, and always good practice to just get used to Flexbox and laying things out. Then after that, I'm going to jump into how we can actually control this thing with gestures. So on the content, I'll set a border radius of 15. And inside of it, we'll add a text element, which says, do you want to fill your autofill your contact info from Facebook? Then below that, I'll skip the gradient, but you can do a gradient button just like Brent has in his mockup with a component that Expo includes called linear gradient, but I'll just do a solid color for now. Or actually even easier, I'll just do a button. Title is login to Facebook. And on press. For now, let's just hide the modal. So we'll set state with modal visible now to false. And then below that, we'll have one more bit of text that says, no thanks. I'm just going to add styles in line to make it look a little better. Margin bottom of 20, or 15. And margin top of 15. Let's see how it looks. Pretty terrible, but that's okay. Let's see, I wonder why border radius is getting cut off. Oh, it's because here's an interesting thing you'll run into sometimes. It's not really clear that this is happening, but the text, of course, has a background always that it inherits from its parent. It's white, and so that is hiding the border radius. So if, for example, I set the background color of this top text to transparent, then the border radius should come back, because it was actually the text background that was getting rid of that. But instead, I'll just add a padding of 30, and I will center the content in this. Justify content, center, and align items, center. All right, a little better. I'll leave it there for now. Let's talk about gestures. Gestures are really important to mobile apps because they're one of the main things that make a mobile app feel really good. You have a lot more control over gestures in native development than you do on web, and similarly, React Native gives you a lot of control. There will most likely be some big changes to the gesture APIs in maybe 3 to 6 months, so everything I tell you now is what you'll want to do for now, but be aware that some of it will probably be updated. Let me share with you a snack. Sounds like I'm going to give you food, which you'd probably prefer. So this, brain food, yes. This snack is for a simple drag gesture. And one of the things that I would always urge you to try with these snacks is always actually try it on your phone. It only takes a second, and you'll see it actually feels way better on your phone than it does in the simulator that's being streamed to your computer. So it feels totally smooth on the phone. When I do it here in the simulator, it's a little jerky. But the idea is we're fully controlling the drag gesture of this square. And if you're coming from web, it's pretty similar to if you were to implement drag events on the web. So it's similar to mouse down, mouse move, mouse up. But because native events are a lot more nuanced, we actually have a lot more events that we can hook into. So this is just copied from the React Native docs, but this is the full list of gesture events. You've got things like on start should set pan responder, on start should set pan responder capture. Same for on move. Then you've got granting, rejecting, sort of the control of gestures. The idea here is that you want different components to be able to suddenly take over control of gestures. Maybe as you're dragging something and you drag over a target, something different should happen. Or maybe you want to drag something that's in a scroll view. How do you know if you should be scrolling the scroll view or dragging the thing within it? These closely imitate how events bubble on the web. So if you even see things like this word capture, this refers to the capture phase and the bubble phase. I won't explain that in great detail, but if you're coming from web, capture phase is the phase where events go from the root element of your UI down to the child element that you actually tapped. So for example, when I tap this square, first the capture phase says the outside view, the container view that makes up the whole screen, receives the event, and then the square inside it. And then after that, after the capture phase, there'll be the bubble phase, where events go back up the other direction. So from the innermost child to the outermost root element. So very similar to the web in a lot of ways, we just have a lot more events that we can use. But often for simple things like drag gestures, you won't need all of the events that are available. So let me show you a brief example of how this thing works. to implement a simple drag and drop, we're going to use a component called a pan responder. You can attach this to any view, so any view can respond to gestures. And you'll see you do it in a slightly unintuitive way, but this pan responder thing is actually like a container for a bunch of event handlers. So it's just an object that you spread into your view. If you wanted to, you could manually specify a whole bunch of events on your view. Pretty much all the ones listed here, plus I think there are even more that aren't part of pan responder. So most of the time, you'll just use a pan responder, but it like wraps some even lower level stuff. And then the way we'll do this is we will have an initial position for this view that we want to drag, and then we'll record the offset as we're dragging. If you're doing this like in a real app, you'd probably want to use animated values here, because that'll ensure like smooth animation. But for simplicity, I'm just going to directly set numbers because it's easier. So the first thing you'll notice is that in component will mount, I set up the pan responder. So I want to handle on start should set pan responder. That's like the same thing as mouse down, this first one. Then I want to handle granting the pan responder, or I forget what it's called. It's like first responder status on iOS, sort of. I don't have a great analogy, but a component can decide whether it wants to actually use the mouse down or like the tap or not. So first you decide, did you get pressed? Then you decide, do you want to handle that press? And if so, you are granted the ability to handle it. Then subsequent moves will all be triggered on the same pan responder, the same component that was granted. I forget what it's called. Let me just look that up real quick. There's this diagram. This might explain a little better. So when a touch comes into an element, first you go through on start should set responder. This is like mouse down. And then if another view claims responder status, then this component can't claim it. However, if this component doesn't, or if another component doesn't claim responder status, then this component can claim it, and it is then granted. If you decide not to claim responder status in onStart should set responder, then suddenly the system waits for moves, and you have more opportunities to claim responder status. It's a little complicated so that you can enable really complex gestures, but it's actually, for basic things, pretty simple in practice, not that different than mouse down, mouse move, mouse up. So we're going to handle move after we're granted responder status, and then release as finger off. Terminate, I'm not 100% sure, but I believe this is analogous to on-touch cancel in web. So it's like some other things can happen that will terminate the gesture. So, yep.
Why did you do that in component will mount versus component did mount?
I guess I wanted it to happen as soon as possible, but it doesn't really matter because you can't touch this thing before the component did mount. So I think either should be totally fine. You'll also notice that pan responder doesn't like directly affect rendering, so I wouldn't put it in state, but I think that's just preference. It's just a property on the component. So okay, so this is the basic setup. And then I'm going to skip render for just a second and come down to how we actually handle these things. So in the handle start should set pan responder, this is basically like on touch, do we want to claim responder status? That's pretty easy in this case, so just return true. When we are granted responder status, what do we do? In this case, I say set state dragging to true. Every time we get a new touch, or every time the touch moves, I want to update the offset of the touch. So we get a special variable called gesture state that's passed to these callbacks, which records a bunch of useful properties. You can read exactly what in the docs, such as where the touch started, how far it's moved, and the current velocity. In this case, we'll just be using how far it's moved, so dy and dx. And as I move, we're just updating this offset top and offset left and re-rendering when it changes. And on handle pan responder end, I want to reset the offset and set the initial top and left to where the thing is currently, so the previous initial top and left plus the offset. Very similar to how this works on the web. The last step is the render. So I do a couple things. I have this dragging thing in state, and that changes the color as I drag to light blue, just an indicator that dragging is occurring. Then top and left are its position, which is its initial position plus how far you've dragged. The only thing that actually renders differently based on dragging position is this one view, which is the box that has the pan responders. So hopefully that's not too complicated. Are there any questions about how to set up a basic gesture using pan responders? Okay, if not, then let's give it a try with our new modal. And I will paste the modal code, or actually, I'll paste the modal code into Slack just in case you haven't been following along thus far and want to. Nope, too large. Make it a snippet. So here's that. So I'm actually going to make the modal draggable using a separate component because I want to abstract out the dragging logic a bit. It's very specific to like positioning, and it shouldn't clutter the business logic of feedback screen. So let's make something called a swipeable component. And I'm going to just copy little bits of code from the snack just to save time. Turn off the preview here. So I know I want all of these imports. Turn on wrapping. I want the pan responder to be set up pretty much the same way. So I want a class swipeable, the extends component. And then I still want to know if it's dragging. I don't need an initial top or left because it's not going to save its position when you release your finger. I'm just going to have it sort of slide back to its default spot. I'm going to take the render function I don't need it to change color anymore. Top and left will just be initial top and initial left because I'm not, no, it'll be, it'll just be offset top and offset left. I don't need this container. And then I pretty much want all of the handling of gestures to work roughly the same way. So I'm just going to copy all of that also. So you should all have the snack in Slack. If you want to just copy and paste most of it like I did, go for it. It would take me too long to write this all out. But we're going to do the same stuff. So when you press the thing, we're going to claim responder status. When we're granted it, we're going to set dragging to true. When we move now, we're going to still update offset top and left. When we end, we no longer need to store initial top and left. We just want to reset the thing. So let me save that. And then in terms of what can actually go in this thing, I want to be able to drag anything. So I'm going to put the children of this component. So we should be able to use this to make anything swipeable. And let's write the style again. So const styles equals stylesheet dot create. Call it box. And we'll say, actually I'm not sure it needs any style stall. I guess we'll say position relative. No, it doesn't even need that. So maybe it doesn't need any styles. But that's fine. It's called box now. The only styles it needs are top and left. So that's my swipeable component. I'll paste it in Slack once I'm sure it works. I'm not sure it works yet. And let me import it. So I'll import swipeable from components. And I should be able to put anything in this swipeable component. So let me go down to the animated view here. And hope this works. Cool. So I can drag this modal around now. It won't be super performant because I'm not using animated, but switching over isn't that difficult. So I might still do that if we have time. So the last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to make it so that as I drag this thing, the opacity decreases, and if I drag it past a certain point, the modal goes away, and I say modal visible is false. So what I'm going to do for that, let me paste this into Slack. What I'm going to do for that is I'm going to make a callback so I can control exactly how the opacity changes. So I'm going to say we'll have an onMove callback, and we'll also have an onEnd callback. For now, we'll use onMove, and I'm going to pass the X position of the gesture. Then we'll also have an onEnd in which I'll pass the X position of the gesture. And so when this thing moves, I'm going to adjust the opacity. On end, I'm going to check if X is beyond a certain point, and if it is, I'll hide the modal. Let me save that. Now, in my feedback screen, I can add these callbacks to swipeable. So I can say on move, I'm getting X. One too many. And I'm going to say let new opacity equals 100 minus x over 100. So I'm going to say if you've moved past 100 pixels, opacity should be 0. So math.max 0. If you've moved past 100 pixels, opacity should be 0. If you've moved somewhere between 0 and 100 pixels, it should be somewhere between 0 and 1. That pretty much covers those cases. So this should give me a new opacity value that I can then use for my modal opacity. So I'm going to say modal opacity dot set value to directly set the value of this to new opacity. Let's see if it works. Doesn't work. And I didn't pass an onEnd. Let's put a placeholder for now. So let me try debugging this a little bit. I'll console.log my new opacity.
I think you passed it the delta x instead of the actual x.
Oh yeah, you're right. So what do I want? But delta x should accumulate over time. So you should be able to move this thing 100 pixels. Let me just console.log it. So let's see. Okay. So the values seem to go between roughly 2 and -2, I guess. So I must just be really off on how the math is working. Let me just log x. Oh, do I need absolute value? That might be it. If this doesn't work, I'm just going to use the formula I used when I was doing this earlier, because not worth spending time on it now. So let's see if this works with my pre-made calculate opacity function. And if it does, I'll explain what that does. So let's see, calculate opacity of x. If it doesn't work, then I set this up differently than I did before. Okay, so I have the math wrong. But what I think I'm doing is saying we have this new x value. X is the accumulated number of pixels that you have moved, the position of this thing. I'll print those out again just because I think it's helpful to see. No? Ah, yes. VS Code doesn't know how to comment within JSX, which is kind of strange. It's not pixels. It's between 0 and 1. Right, because I'm just console logging the opacity. That's not important. Anyway, I guess I could explain this more, but you can probably just trust me on it that x is moving in terms of pixels. If I take the absolute value and then 100 minus that divided by 100. It's sort of a ratio of how far have you moved along a line that's 100 pixels. And I'll push this code after if you want to see that exactly. So as I move this thing, X is changing, and I change the opacity to match. You can see when I get to a certain point, I lose the thing entirely until I click again, and it sort of snaps back. So instead of that, all I want to do is I want to make it so that when the drag ends, I can even just copy the function I use here. When the drag ends, I want to see if my new opacity is really small, so let's say less than 0.1, then I want to hide this thing entirely. So I want to say set state modal visible to false, and I'll just animate the modal opacity to 0. Otherwise, this means you've released the thing, but not far enough away that we want it to disappear. So we'll just set modal opacity to 1. Let's try that. So if I drag it away, it'll sort of snap back. And you could, of course, use animated values, so even you could spring this back if you wanted to. You could make the transitions smoother and nicer. For example, instead of doing set value 1, I could do animated.spring of modal opacity to value 1. And then it'll have a much smoother animation. Got to start it. And you could imagine setting the modal itself to spring back. Then if I drag it beyond a certain point, it disappears entirely, and I can open it up again. So that's how you would make simple animations and gestures for controlling something like a modal. You could also imagine doing something like this for drag and drop to rearrange things in a list. Pretty much anything that uses gestures will just be a complex combination of views and pan responders. Any questions about gestures, animation, anything like that? Push this up to GitHub. Yep.
So pan responder is abstraction over the gesture responder system. When would you just use the low
So I've actually never needed to in a real app. So I guess, let me look at it real quick. Oh, yes, thanks. So pan responder is a layer, it's an abstraction layer on top of the gesture responder system. Basically what you get with pan responder is you get these convenient events that tell you like the exact state of the gesture, how far you've moved, the velocity, where the gesture started, that sort of thing. So it's generally way easier to build gestures using pan responder. However, if you need to, you can drop one level lower and you can deal with the native events directly to figure out the exact like position, timestamp, how many fingers are on the screen. So I guess it's just if you want to make gestures that like are more complicated than one finger, you would want to drop down. I've never actually done that, but I assume this is very similar to if you were handling it yourself on web with on-touch start, move, and end. You have to look at the array of touches. You have to figure out which gesture is happening. I don't know if Brent has any experience with the using gesture responder directly versus, nope. Yeah, not that common, but certainly if you're doing complex like pinch and rotate, you can touch on it. Other questions? Cool. It's probably a good time for 10-minute break, having just an animation and gestures. Feel free to ask questions or play with it on your phone or whatever.